the second session. It's getting so for this next talk we have Björn Ruytenberg, and he is a security researcher in hardware, firmware, and OS security. He's also author of Bendrath, for which I once had the pleasure to have him work for the best cybersecurity master in the Netherlands. And now he's a PhD candidate at the
Hello everyone, thank you for joining and for having me at TU Eindhoven. My name is Björn Ruytenberg. I'm a PhD candidate at FUSEC at Universiteit Amsterdam. I'm a security researcher and maintainer of HyperUPG, which we'll be talking about in a bit. And my research mainly focuses on UEFI, hypervisor, and PCI Express security. Some of my previous work, as already mentioned, is critical Intel Thunderbolt vulnerabilities, which I had the pleasure of finishing as part of my master thesis here at TU Eindhoven. So, digital rights management, or DRM, is what we will be talking about today. DRM protects high-value audio-video content served by the major streaming vendors. And the key idea behind DRM is not necessarily to make it entirely impossible to pirate content, but to make it very difficult or otherwise very unattractive to do so. And the idea is that, content pirates have to resort to either analog output or some digital conversion steps. And these methods should always come at a cost in terms of money, but also in terms of quality. And this goes especially for high-value content like 4K video and lossless audio, which are usually protected by a hardware-backed DRM pipeline. Which is in turn usually implemented using a trusted execution network, as it is called. Now, in short, the work that I'll be presenting today relies on the key insight that these hardware-backed DRM technologies provide really strong security guarantees, but they have never really considered the device I/O boundary, and so that is the key vulnerability that we're exploiting in our work. DRM comes in many different forms, and each come with a certain set of security guarantees. So, software-based DRM is the most basic form, and this is how DRM started out for streaming media back in the early 2010s. So, until this era, attacks mostly included capturing the screen, or using virtual audio devices to capture the audio. But these loopholes were pretty soon closed at the operating system level or DRM runtime. And it is at this point that DRM started to be scrutinized in academia and in the industry. And so one of the papers that first started looking at this kind of question is one that is aptly called Steal This Movie, as you can see on the right. And Steal This Movie was soon accompanied by the YouTube DL project, these days also known as YTDLP, which lets you download videos from YouTube. Whiteley and Narrowbeer, which we'll be talking a little bit about in a bit. Software-based DRM was in part improved by a hybrid software and hardware-based solution. Slightly better security guarantees were offered by this kind of setup where encryption keys are stored in a trusted execution environment. And the idea is that the operating system never gets to access the key material. Now, there is one documented vulnerability, which you see right here by security explorations, but it was never publicly disclosed. The modern DRM landscape is mostly dominated by Google Wi-Fi and Microsoft Play Ready, and the examples that we saw in the previous slides are examples of attacks on the lower two tiers right here on this slide, including Google Wi-Fi L3 and Microsoft Clarity SS2000. The higher security tiers is where things start to get interesting. So with Google Wi-Fi L1, decryption happens in a TE, like previously, but the plaintext material, the plaintext stream, never leaves the TE. It goes directly to the output device. And so the operating system never gets to access the plaintext stream. Plaintext SS3000 at the bottom expands on that scheme by adding remote attestation of the entire Playwright technology stack, including the operating system kernel, the device drivers, and hardware, and including the detection of virtual hardware, like in the context of Omnibus. Now, none of these hardware-based DRM tiers have been broken or bypassed so far. So that's what we're going to do. Let's bypass hardware-based DRM. In a nutshell, we have achieved a full DRM security protocol bypass across all major DRM systems at maximum security settings. And all of the major streaming vendors are impacted, including Amazon, Netflix, and Spotify. It's a fully software-based attack in the sense that we do not require any special kind of hardware, no HDMI switches, no terminators, no PCI Express bus interposers, or anything else you can think of. We also do not exploit any implementation flaws. No, we don't break any cryptographic primitives or compromise any remote licensing servers. Last but not least, we do require a privileged adversary, but yeah, so this means an attacker with root access or administrative privileges. But this privileged access is explicitly in scope for DRM vendor protocol. And so our attack bypasses DRM right from the lowest tiers up until the maximum security tiers. Okay, so introducing modern DRM architecture. On the left, we have the streaming service CDN, like Netflix or Spotify, serving the content to the web browser. And the DRM user mode runtime then receives decryption keys from the licensing server, which are encrypted in the trusted executing environment public. So the TE is right at the bottom, implemented in the GPU. This is pretty much how the Playwright spec defines its DRM architecture, so that's not really a lot, as you can see. And for us, this leaves many open questions, right? So at what point is the stream decrypted? And at what point does the plaintext stream flow to the output device throughout this entire architecture? Now, to reverse engineering, we found out that after the TE decrypts the contents, the stream is returned to the kernel mode DRM driver. And from that point on, a plaintext buffer is shared with the HD audio device driver, which in turn shares this plaintext stream in chunks via a direct memory buffer. Via the direct memory buffer. Pardon me, a DMA buffer that is sharing the chunks with the HD audio device. So, from the attacker's perspective, there's many options, right? So you could, for example, replace either of these device drivers with one that you control yourself, or you can replace the TE at the bottom with one that just reveals the keys. Fortunately for the attacker, it's not that easy. So first, the device drivers are WHQL signed, which is the Microsoft Windows code signing procedure. And the TE embeds a certificate that is trusted by a Playwright-specific PKI. Second, the entire DRM runtime that you see here, including the OS kernel and finally the TE itself, are subject to attestation towards the Playwright licensing server. And so if you were to replace any of these, you would immediately fail Playwright attestation. Well, how about keeping everything in place, but then using a debugger to hook any of these, hook any functions in any of these components, right? Well, there is a bit of a problem with that. So Microsoft uses a tool that they developed internally called Warbird, and Warbird obfuscates all of this code. Now, there was a source code leak of Warbird, so you know, there's a side channel there that you can use, but still, it's quite complicated. Yeah, so maybe there are better options. Suppose that somehow you could deobfuscate the runtime, and you could hook interesting functions and, you know, do something useful there. There is a kernel runtime protection called patchdog. It's like a daemon that runs in the background, continuously checks for anything suspicious going on, as in anything that tries to hook kernel functions. And if it does catch you, then it will be associated with the kernel. So it's game over at that point. Okay, so what other options do we have then? Well, we know that Playwright does hypervisor detection, so we cannot fully virtualize the entire operating system and then just intercept all I/O to the HD audio device. What we can do is putting the operating system under so-called introspection, using a technique called virtual machine introspection. And here we do not virtualize the entire operating system, but only parts of the physical memory that we want to monitor, basically. So what we do is we put the OS under introspection, as you mind, and we put a thin hypervisor layer in between that does I/O interception between the HD audio device driver and the HD audio device. Only virtualizing those parts of physical memory that are involved in I/O between those two. Diving a little bit deeper into the technical details, if you're interested. So, Dreamcatcher, as we call our attack, starts with discovering the DMA buffers. HD audio devices, they have several input and output streams, right? Microphone and multiple speakers or headphones you may have attached, and they expose them via the base address registers or bars. So what we do is scan these registers for the output stream that we're interested in, and find the registers that let us tell what the state of the stream is. So you see there's a stream status and a stream control. And so what we do is synchronize on these so-called DMA control registers to find out when the content in the DMA buffers is valid. So when the chunk of the audio stream is basically valid for us to make a copy of. And we do this continuously until we've completed capturing the entire song. Then we reconstruct it as a plaintext PCM bit stream, and then convert it to a WAV file that you can play in any modern media player. Some brief details on how this works under the hood. We use extended page tables. This is a CPU extension on Intel that lets you virtualize operating systems, but instead we use it for debugging purposes. So what basically happens is Dreamcatcher marks the memory mapped I/O regions as non-readable, and when the device driver touches any of those regions, we get a callback as a hypervisor, and we can then do inspection of the access. We can make a copy of the buffer that's being accessed, and then we re-enable driver execution, and we continuously do this in a loop until we've done the entire song, and then we resume driver execution, basically. So we implemented all of this by extending HyperDBG. So in a nutshell, what is HyperDBG? Well, it's a hypervisor-based debugger project that my co-author, Sina Karvandi, is also here somewhere in the audience, and I co-lead. I could fill another talk about how HybridGG works, but basically, at a high level, HybridGG uses hypervisor CPU extensions to build a debugger. And this opens up a lot of use cases that are normally not possible with traditional debuggers. If you're interested, it's open source. Feel free to grab it from our GitHub repo. And patches are more than welcome. Right, like I already mentioned, all of the major streaming services are affected all across the board. I'd like to add a special mention for Netflix, which uses the highest hardware-backed security levels, both implementing Play-Ready SL3000 using a compatible GPU on the one end, and Wi-Fi L1 on SGX, Intel SGX, where it's still supported on Intel CPUs. Also special mention for Spotify lossless. This was pretty interesting, and we only found out about this recently. Spotify apparently uses a DRAM that they developed in-house called PlayPlay. Yeah, we didn't know about this. It's not really well documented. For us, however, there was basically no difference. The attack works just as well with PlayPlay. And for Apple Music lossless, we could not identify the DRAM at all. There is something called FairPlay, but on Windows, FairPlay plays a limited role, and it's not entirely clear when it's being used for Apple Music there as well. But again, the attack works perfectly fine with the Apple Music lossless streams. Some words about potential mitigations. So one thing that the impact offenders could do is limit audio to HDMI HTTP protected outputs. So HTTP is basically a copy protection layer that goes over the HDMI wire. Now, of course, this would exclude devices without a GPU. So think about headphones or speakers. You would not be able to play audio streams anymore on those devices. So that's not really an option. Also, HTTP is not really 100% secure. There's many vulnerabilities out there that you could exploit to circumvent HTTP. In terms of the AC audio devices itself, you could extend the encryption pipeline to an on-device key, so that the plaintext does not have to be routed back into kernel space. This would work, but obviously you would render all AC audio devices out there obsolete. And the same goes for doing some kind of extended hardware attestation. Finally, there is moving the decryption pipeline into confidential virtual machines using Intel PDX or AMD SUV. This would likely work to some extent, but this requires the CPU to support these virtualization extensions, which is not always the case on consumer devices. And also, TDX and NTV are subject to vulnerabilities. And last but not least, you could employ hypervisor detection and anti-debugger techniques. This is already actually the case with Play-Ready, as we've seen. And for us, it's, it was a bit of a challenge, but we could overcome them in the end, and we don't expect that this is a mitigation that would really help, because it will always be an arms race, and attackers will always find ways around this. Right, moving on to a demo. Okay, so what we have here is sure. Yes. Which, click here first. Okay. Perfect. Thank you. Okay, so this is Netflix playing a Ed Sheeran concert. And that's why we have to pick something else. So as you can see, the screen is completely black. The reason for this is that we cannot capture the screen, obviously, using any screen capturing tools, because hardware here is preventing us from doing that. So what we do is, in a moment, we will show picture-in-picture at the top right what is happening on the screen with a video that we recorded using a phone, so that you can see what is happening. Okay, so there it is on the rooftop. This is the HyperUBG terminal. So we load HyperUBG, and then we go to our nodes, which we share with the vendors in our disclosure process. The first step is that we print all of the PCI Express devices in the system. So that's what we're going to do with PCI tree. And then we pick the HD audio device, which is named Canon PCH CATS here. And we're going to find out where the base address registers are. So we have the addresses right here. And what we would like to do is inspect what is going on in these registers. So we're going to dereference them for the next 200 hex bytes. So that's what we're going to do now. Now, through reverse engineering, we decoded this pattern that you see right here, and we know that these values that are being highlighted right now is what we would like, because that's where the buffers live. So what we do here, what we see here is that the buffers are 780 hex bytes long. So we grab both of these addresses that point to these buffers, and we update the HyperUBG source code to target these addresses. Right. Now we need to unload HyperUBG because obviously we need to recompile. That's what we're going to do now. Okay. Scrolling a bit further down, we're going to initialize a buffer that we control to copy over all of the Plaintext data. So that's what we do using the PCI dump command. As you can see, showing is initialized. And now we are going to basically intercept all of the I/O between the HDI device and the device driver. First, we need to play the stream. There should be some audio in there. From my laptop. We're filling the buffer. We let it play for a little bit. Well, that's enough, right? We have some audio samples. And what we're going to do now is dump the samples to a file, to the local file system, test.bin. Now, this test.bin is a file format that we designed ourselves, so we need to do a bit of processing to convert that in a lossless way to PCM lossless audio. So that's what we're going to do with a simple Python script that we wrote. We're going to open the terminal and run our Python script. Oh, yeah, also run Audacity. So we run the a kind of script which converts the doc into two individual PCM raw audio files, which you see here. And we're going to import them into Audacity. And we're going to tell Audacity that it's signed 16-bit PCM, little endian, 2-channel stereo, and 48,000 hertz. There we go, we have a nice waveform. And there's the audio. Okay, so that was it for the demo. Now, this is security and types of surveillance, so we should also talk about security and privacy implications of DRM. So we have content security at varying protection levels. What does that mean for the user in terms of security and privacy? Well, one of the first examples of DRM going wrong is the infamous Sony audio CD rootkit back in 2005. So without users knowing, when they would insert a Sony audio CD into their Windows system, it would automatically install without their consent a rootkit. And this rootkit would hijack the operating system internals to hide its presence, basically employing malware-like techniques. So what it would do is batch syscalls, and it would filter all of the access to to the CD and DVD device, and basically it would restrict audio CD access to Sony's own media player that they would ship on the same CD, right? So it's a Sony audio player application. You would have to use only that application to be able to play the CD. But it would not only affect Sony CDs, it would affect any audio CDs from that point on insert. Also, it would return garbage data to any other applications. So for example, if you were to use Nero Burning ROM at the time, or other audio or more generally CD copying applications, it would not be able to access the audio CD tracks. So it was, to a certain extent, effective from a content protection perspective, but it also created an attack surface for malware. So what happened is that this rootkit used overly permissive file system permissions. So basically, it was for malware pretty easy to replace the rootkit binaries with their own binaries, and then being launched using administrator privileges. Well, from that point on, obviously it came over, right? So the malware could inject itself into kernel space, compromise the entire system, and it could even hide its own presence from antivirus solutions. Didn't stop there. So unintentionally or not, Storm turned out to be a root trendsetter. DRM from that point on started shipping rootkits as part of their software package. A prime example is Macrovision Save Disk, which was often used in many software applications and also video games to prevent unauthorized copying. And much like the Sony example, they all employed rootkit techniques to hide their presence and to protect whatever content they needed to protect. Now, this obviously made them a high-value target for malware developers to find vulnerabilities, and they surely did. So what they did basically was abuse these vulnerable drivers to hide their presence again and to compromise the entire system. I have two examples here. One is from 2007, where there was just a public POC made available on Expo, and on the right from 2018, so pretty recently actually, where the same DRM package was found to be vulnerable, and just the POC popped up on GitHub that would let you instantly exploit the vulnerabilities. Another trend is moving VRM away from rootkits in more recent times to a TE. So this is a diagram that I showed previously, but yeah, the TE right here at the bottom is currently where VRM code lives. And this isn't just a TE, right? It's a graphics card, or in other words, a PCI Express device that has system-wide memory view, which is even higher privilege level than just kernel space. Now, fortunately, the good news is that at least so far, no serious vulnerabilities have been reported at this level. The bad news is, however, when things do go wrong, they will compromise the entire system. And this time, it will happen from the hardware side. So what about privacy? So we briefly talked about how VRM licensing works, right? So the user requests the content from the streaming service, and then some license and keys are being exchanged with the VRM vendor backend. And if we zoom out a little bit and abstract that process, this is what we see. Now, this system depends on sharing a unique client fingerprint. In hardware-based DRM, this is coming from a TE. In software-based DRM, this is coming from fingerprinting, basically the web browser. Yeah, right there. And this client fingerprint is also, interestingly, shared with streaming services. We don't really know the rationale behind it, but we do know that Netflix, for example, uses this fingerprint to watermark content and to trace back leaks to devices in case content gets leaked. Now imagine that this streaming service is replaced by some random website. And this random website claims to be hosting DRM protected content. Then this will trigger the web browser to send that same unique client fingerprint to the website. Not ideal, but the impact is limited. But imagine that many websites do this, and all these websites use some ad broker or analytics networks. This is basically how user tracking works in traditional advertisement networks, and the same could happen with client unique fingerprints. In fact, it is already happening, and while there is a lot of research on how to design privacy-friendly DRM systems, there is surprisingly little research about using this as an attack vector to fingerprint users and track them across websites. And so I would like to highlight this paper, this research by Bendrath, Mohammed Saad, and Pierre-Alain Fouque, if I pronounce that correctly. So Bendrath is mostly known for his work on breaking Wi-Fi, the software-based level, and he extended that research together with his co-authors to privacy implications of Wi-Fi. And he showed that with a very simple POC, which you see on the right, we can basically trigger the browser to send that fingerprint and then send it to an attacker-controlled backend. Fortunately, there is also good news. So browsers come with a number of options that you can use as a mitigation. The easiest, though probably not the most convenient ways, is to disable DRM protected content playback altogether. A slightly more practical approach would be if you just consider creating a fresh profile on each streaming session. And Firefox these days, since a few versions ago, I believe, makes this really easy. Do note that container hubs are not sufficient. You really need to refresh your profile. For hardware-based DRM, on the other hand, unfortunately, there's no easy solutions, unless you have a stack of GPUs that you can swap out every now and then. Pretty expensive these days, so I wouldn't recommend it. That brings me to the end of the talk. So we've seen that hardware-backed DRM provides really strong string theory guarantees, but it does not take into account the final peripheral handoff, and this was an oversight that is that is affecting Wi-Fi on one and Microsoft Liberty SL3000, and with Dreamcatcher basically we showed a class break attack that exploits this vulnerability. Now we disclosed it to the affected vendors in September 2025. The vendor response is still pending. Considering the nature of the vulnerability, we believe it would be very difficult to mitigate or actually fix. We would not be surprised if a revision of the HD audio standard would be necessary, or a revision of silicon. And finally, as we've seen, DRM content protection and user security and privacy trade-offs remain a difficult challenge for the industry. There's content protection, but it's not always equally valued enough, I would say, as user privacy. And we will have to see what happens in the future in this context. So, thank you very much for your attention, and I would be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Björn, for the great talk. Now we have questions in the audience.
Thanks for the great talk. Have there been you said that the disclosure is saying that the 30 gigs and presumably they're 90% some vulnerability. If they're still on the first step, the experience that I have. Have you seen any response, for example, software patches or anything at all where you're trying to prevent your attacks from working?
So on the wide-defined end, no. For Plain Ready, we saw recently some updates to the Windows driver SDK that we use for compiling HyperPG, where some changes were being made that, in some way hinder our attack. It's hard to tell whether it was really a patch meant to address our work, and we could easily circumvent it by just linking against the older SDK. Basically, we're waiting for more information from Microsoft at this point, but no, there's been no real fix of mitigation at this point.
Congrats.
Rachel, thank you. I was wondering if there is any specific challenge that makes video recovery different than audio, and what would that be?
Thanks for this question. I was hoping someone would ask that. So, about video. Basically, the video encryption pipeline is pretty different in the sense that the TEE is also the output device in this case. So as you can see right here, the TEE is implemented in the GPU, but the GPU also presents picture on the display. And therefore, it never gets returned to the kernel space. That doesn't mean it's impossible to attack this encryption or decryption pipeline, but it would require a different attack.
Thank you.
First of all, thank you for an awesome presentation. I was wondering, because you mentioned before the high price detection, it would be possible to circumvent that in order to reset some appeals. Also, some elements inside memory. Reset, copy load to one machine, and with memory for instance to extract the information. Would it be a little bit possible?
Well, I mean, obviously there's ways to do this without hypervisors even, so you can do a DMA attack, where basically if you freeze the system state, you copy over all the contents from memory, and the CPU would not even notice, because in this case, DMA happens by the memory controller. Obviously, there's a bit of work that you need to do to synchronize when you dump the buffers. And this will be a little bit more involved than when you have a hypermarket. But yes, it's certainly possible.
Okay, thank you.
We have one last question.
I was just wondering how widely used are these hardware, these running computer always has this hardware mechanisms that they can use or not?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
So these trusted execution environments, they're in all modern hardware, I guess?
You mean the one implemented in the GPU?
Yeah.
Yes. So Microsoft apparently a few years ago, the point in time is not exactly clear, but they made a deal with the silicon vendors, including AMD, NVIDIA, and Intel, to implement this CE inside of their GPUs. So if you have a reasonably modern system, this goes back as far as 2017, because we tested on a 2017 system, if I remember correctly, then you will have a play-ready compliance system, and you will have the TE. Yeah.
Okay, so let's thank Björn for the
with the technical details to start. So this second session, it is going to be online, as you see on the screen, but we have two speakers. So one of them is Ralf Bendrath, and he is an advisor on civil liberties, justice, and home affairs. And then we have Thomas Lohninger, and he's from Epicenter Works. And they will be telling us all about the EU's reform agenda, specifically this legislation that is called Digital Simplification Package. So, yes, the speakers online, if you're ready.
Great, hello and welcome. We are both sorry that we couldn't be with you in person, but nevertheless it's great to be at this amazing event, and we want to talk you through the current reform agenda of the European Union. Ralf and I are both working on this. We have different roles. I'm executive director of the Digital Rights NGO Epicenter Works. We've been involved with EU policies over the past 16 years. And Ralf will introduce himself.
Yes, I work for the Greens in the European Parliament, and back in the day, more than 10 years ago, I worked for the chief negotiator on the General Data Protection Regulation. The picture here you see is my laptop on the last day of the negotiations. The text on the laptop screen is the GDPR. So now the Commission is proposing to change and weaken the General Data Protection Regulation. So for me, this is personal.
And we want to walk you through what the hell is going on, and we do not expect anyone to know something about Europe or Brussels or digital rights. This should really be inclusive, and at the end we also want to have time for your questions. But what even is an omnibus? Because omnibus is a word you hear all the time here. And of course it comes from real buses. It is a form of carriage, either a horse carriage or automobile, that carries many people. So you mix things into one container in a way and transport it. But in lawmaking, of course, it refers to same principle, but a package of different legislations or laws that concern unrelated topics, but that are voted on as block, and thereby can basically a drive-by shooting of many other legislations all at once.
So how did we get here? This kind of started in 2023 when the Commission President Ursula von der Leyen asked Mario Draghi, this other guy here, former chief of the European Central Bank, to write a report on the future of European competitiveness, because you could argue we are kind of lagging behind the US in terms of artificial intelligence, behind China and on electric cars and so on. So how could we improve European competitiveness, make European companies more competitive on the global market again? Fair question, you could argue, and he published his report and handed it over to the Commission in September 2024. And this then was taken by the Commission to kick off a whole reform agenda.
Yeah, and we see here a range of different laws that are sadly still in German, but you basically can see, might it be the due diligence issues or issues around food safety, defense, chemicals, automobiles, environment. It's really a broad simplification agenda, and the yellow highlighted parts are the digital ones that we're going to talk about. And Ralf was in the negotiations on most of them, if not all of them. And so we have the small mid-size caps that's already concluded, the AI Act that's already concluded, the data one, that's going to be a major issue for us. And then there's also the Digital Networks Act that I'm going to talk about, which concerns net neutrality and is also an attempt to deregulate. And lastly, there's also a non-specified digital fitness check that might also lead to further changes to other laws, but we do not have the details about that yet. And from a civil society perspective, it is extremely interesting to see the broad range of stakeholders that are engaging here. This is not just the usual suspects like the Chaos Computer Clubs and EDRIs and EFFs. This is really going from the Latvian police force to the Beekeeper Association of Europe. It includes most, if not all, environmental organizations and unions, but also fair trade groups. And so what we are faced with is really an unprecedented level of solidarity. That is also a quite hopeful message, because we are all faced with the same agenda and the same stupid logic to take away all of the civil liberties that we have gained in the past 10 years. Underlying all of this, of course, is the new right-wing majority in the European Parliament that we have since the election 2024.
Yeah, and you can really see how they are more and more radicalizing. It started again with competitiveness, but now with the Omnibus agenda has turned into simplification, quote unquote, and now they're openly speaking about deregulation. And we have a video here, but unfortunately I understand you don't hear the sound, so we will have to skip this. This is Ursula von der Leyen at a conference 1 year after the Draghi report, where she basically says, we all agree we need simplification, we need deregulation. But it's not just Ursula von der Leyen. Next slide. This is Svenja Hahn, a German liberal member of the European Parliament. This is 1 week before the digital omnibus proposal came out last November, an op-ed in the German Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung. I mean, you see the title. This is the mindset.
And you could then think, is this actually supported by the European population? I think we can all agree that we have problems with big tech. I think nobody is doubting that. And many also would see the European Union in the leading role to come up with solutions for these multilateral problems. And we are all aware that Donald Trump doesn't like regulating big tech because that's where a lot of his money comes from. And so if you then put these two things in a poll, you see that actually 2/3 of the population in the 3 largest countries in Europe are still in favor of regulating big tech, even if it would deteriorate the relationships with a Trump administration. So I would argue there's no real backing for what the Commission is doing here, even if you factor in global circumstances. And now about the impact of the reform.
Yes, what's happening actually? What are they proposing in terms of substance on the digital front? As Thomas mentioned, there was already the so-called fourth omnibus on small mid-caps. This is small companies that are bigger than SMEs, but not too big. Mid-cap stands for small companies with medium market capitalization. There, they already changed the GDPR by deleting the obligation to keep a record of your processing activities, basically to know what you're doing with personal data when you're a small mid-cap. At least we managed some damage control here, and still now, if you already have an obligation under the GDPR to appoint a data protection officer or to do a data protection impact assessment because your data processing is high risk, then you still need to keep this record. So that's already done more or less. We will vote it in the committee level next week. But the big reform is now the so-called 7th omnibus that was presented on 19th November last year, which consists of 2 omnibus laws. One is on the Artificial Intelligence Act. We'll come to that later, but that's also maybe more or less already done. And the other one is the big data or digital omnibus, which is amending a whole bunch of laws, the General Data Protection Regulation, the e-privacy directive, the Open Data Directive, the Platform to Business Regulation, the Data Act, the Data Governance Act, and the Network and Information Security Directive 2, I think. So some people in Brussels already call it the big, beautiful data bill. And here they are really going, next slide, at the core of data protection. They're not just deleting some rules or making some rules simpler or maybe deleting some obligations for small companies and so on. They're going really at the core, which is the definition of personal data. Because if you suddenly say this data is not personal data anymore, then the whole data protection law doesn't apply and you're completely out. You can do with the data whatever you want, sell it to China, publish it, remix it, whatever. So in the GDPR, we of course already have a definition, quite clear. It's any information relating to an identified or identifiable natural person, so-called data subject. And an identifiable natural person is one who can be identified directly or indirectly, in particular by reference to an identifier such as a name, an identification number, location data, an online identifier, and so on. And in recital 26, we even then clarified, that was really important for us, that it doesn't mean that you have to know the person by name. You can identify them with their civic identity, so to speak, but it's sufficient if you can single them out. So you can recognize them when you see them again, basically. And that's basically relating to all this online web tracking and stuff. So now the Commission is proposing to change the definition, as you see on the screen, by saying information relating to a natural person is not necessarily personal data for every other person or entity, merely because another entity can identify that natural person. And such information does not become personal for that entity merely because somebody else has means reasonably likely to identify that person. So basically they're saying in the same data processing ecosystem, in the same supply chain, for some entities it's personal data and the whole data protection law applies, and for others it's not personal data and they're completely out and can do with the data for whatever they want. But then somebody further down in the supply chain again would be able to identify that persons, and the whole data protection key would apply. It's a bit crazy. They are arguing this comes from a Court of Justice decision last September, the so-called Single Resolution Board judgment. But that was a very specific case. This was not even about identifiers about persons, it was identifiers about user comments made to the Single Resolution Board, which they handed over to Deloitte for further processing. So the identifiers were not even linked to persons, they were linked to comments. And there have also been other judgments in the past on when is data personal data. The Breyer judgment, you probably have heard of Patrick Breyer, our former pirate member here, where the court decided IP addresses are personal data. Also, if you are not the ISP, the access provider, but just some website. Or the Scania case, where the court said the vehicle identification number is personal data, even if Scania does not know which user has which number, but the registration authorities do so. And again, this is all linked to this notion of singling out. And again, we had a video here, next slide, but we can't play it for you, so we skip it. This is just a small snippet from a movie, a documentary that was done back in the day on the General Data Protection Regulation negotiations, where we had an exchange with the European Data Protection Supervisor, and he also explained what singling out means. The Commission is even proposing more on this front. They're also proposing to give themselves the power by implementing acts to decide when pseudonymized data becomes anonymous data, meaning the data protection regulation, the whole data protection law does not apply. And implementing acts are normally powers for the Commission to apply technical stuff in very specific cases. And they cannot be done for amending core elements of normal legislation. And for implementing acts, the Parliament even doesn't have any veto power. So this is also a bit crazy. But that's what they're proposing. Next slide. We also have another crazy definition proposed, because back then we already said, okay, if you have data already, you can further process it for other purposes, but this is kind of acceptable and not in breach of the purpose limitation principle, because it's fair purposes, so to speak. If you use it just for statistical purposes, scientific research purposes, or historical archiving purposes. And we never fully decided what scientific research mean. I mean, there's a whole Directorate General in the Commission dealing with that. And there's also the research and scientific research associations and bodies who all have an understanding of what scientific research is. But now the Commission is proposing in the Omnibus on the GDPR to suddenly establish a union-wide definition of what scientific research is. And they start with, it means any research which can also support innovation. Yeah. I mean, I'm a former researcher. Before I came to Brussels, I worked at several universities in Germany, the Netherlands, and the US for 10 years, doing research in political science, among others, on the history of data protection. But that was not leading to innovation, you could argue. So I would be out, but anybody who is using data for AI training could argue this is scientific research because it leads to innovation. But they even say it shall contribute to existing scientific knowledge, fair enough, or apply existing knowledge in novel ways. So you just take existing knowledge and apply it somewhere else, and that is considered scientific research. Well, not exactly, I would think. But I mean, you're at the university right now, I understand, so maybe you have thoughts on this. When we discussed it with the commission on technical level in the first round a month ago or so, they already conceded that this might need some fine-tuning. But you see the direction behind this innovation mantra. Next slide. This all is, of course, done with artificial intelligence, quote unquote, in mind. Where the Commission is also now proposing a new Article 88C in the GDPR, where they say using personal data for AI training is in your legitimate interest, which is one of the legal bases for processing personal data under Article 6. But even here, they don't simplify things, because they still say, but if the data subjects, the person's rights and interests override your interest in AI training, then you cannot do it. And you still have to do this balancing test in each specific circumstance. So it's not even simplification. It's just hinting at AI. But even if they would clearly say, no, go back, please. If they would clearly say using personal data for AI training is legal, full stop. Still, there would be problems, because then still my rights as a so-called data subject would still apply, like my right to have my data erased, my right to object, my right to have my data corrected. So, for example, when ChatGPT came out 4 years ago, roughly, I asked it, who is Ralf Bendrath? And the answer was, Ralf Bendrath is a data protection expert, blah, blah, blah. That was okay. But then he is a professor at the Technical University of Darmstadt. I mean, I don't even have a PhD. I never finished. And I've never worked in Darmstadt. So how do I get my data corrected? It's not easy, because there's no database field where they can just change the entry for Ralf Bendrath. It's in the statistical white noise of the weight AI model, you know. Still difficult to have AI with personal data. But then if you ask people what they think about this, it's very clear. Neub, none of your business. The NGO of Max Schrems in Vienna did a survey last year with Meta users. Only 7% of Meta users want Meta to train AI with their personal data. Next slide. So this is basically where we are on AI and data protection. The question, of course, is how to rescue the child in the front. But there's more. They're now saying also my right to have access to my data, to get request and get a copy of my data somebody else is processing, is limited, because I can only use it basically to check data protection compliance. But I cannot use that data for other purposes. That they call that abuse, which is also absurd. I mean, I have this right. It's even in primary law, in the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the EU, and in the treaties. I can request a copy of my data. Okay, I can access my data, full stop, no conditions, no limitations. What I do with the data, it's my data, you know. And this right has been used by, let's say, trade unions when employees requested data about how many overhours they have from their employer. And the purpose, of course, was not to see if the employer is compliant with data protection law. The purpose was to get paid for the overhours. Fair enough. And they now say this would be abuse, because you want to use the data for other purposes, and then the data controller can refuse to give you your data. It's absurd. There's been one case recently at the Court of Justice from a guy from Austria, the so-called Brillenrottler case about a German eyeglasses company, where he subscribed to newsletters of companies systematically to then ask for a copy of his data. And when they didn't give him the data quickly enough, he asked for compensation for immaterial damage. That was kind of his business model. But the guy was all over the place when you Googled him, and it was clear. The court also said he intentionally created the situation where then he would request his data. So this is abuse. Okay, fair enough. But the point is the court was able to decide this on the basis of the current wording of the GDPR. No need to change anything. Okay, then we still have some good elements. I'm not sure if the present announcement of our presentation also contained the words may contain traces of hope. The Commission is also proposing to deal with the cookie banners finally. New Articles 88A and 88B would basically give you a one-click option to get rid of the cookie banners and say, no, don't track me. And they would also introduce, next slide, mandatory, not voluntary, mandatory browser signals, also mandatory for browser manufacturers, to basically automatically tell a website to not track yourself. Which is good. There's still some questions on, can my browser give consent on my behalf, or is it not informed, or things like that. But this is actually going in a good direction. The question is if it will survive, because there's super, super heavy lobbying against it at the moment by big tech, but also by the publishing industry and others, because they of course fear their business model of surveillance capitalism could be undermined with this. There's some small issues that are kind of okay. Easier information obligations for, like, if I become a member of my local sports club and I know that they only use my data for managing my sports club membership, to send me the newsletters and invite me to the summer football tournament or whatever, then I don't need to know if they have a data protection officer or who that is. It's fine if this is very in a limited relationship and so on. Totally fine. We can accept that, I guess. They also propose a single reporting point in case of data breaches under different EU laws on data protection, but also on IT security. A harmonized list for data protection impact assessments, when you have to do one and when not. This will now be harmonized on the European level. And this is one of the things Mario Draghi actually said in his report, that part of the problem with the GDPR is the different application and implementation in 27 member states. So if you have things now harmonized on the European level, that's simplification we can support. So far, so good, or so bad on the GDPR. Next is again the AI Act with Thomas.
Yes. So as you've seen, the Omnibus package it doesn't only contain the Data Act, but also a separate proposal for the AI Act, which was under a more expedient procedure because, as you'll see, this was more time critical, and it is already agreed. So we have a result that I think also was voted in Parliament. So this is basically a done deal. So we can look at what has been agreed. The most important thing was really the so-called stop the clock proposal. What this does is it prevented the applicability of certain rules that are aiming to protect us from very high-risk systems of AI, and it would push the deadlines further down. This already has done quite a lot of damage because many member states have used this as a signal to not do their homework, to not appoint the responsible regulators, to not adopt national legislation, to really give effect to the AI Act, although it's a regulation. Some things need to be done nationally for the whole thing to work. Also, you need the budget for people if they have new duties. And all of this was basically shelved, and in several member states is still undecided. So that really is bad because these rules were adopted with a clear purpose to protect society, and particularly the most vulnerable parts of society. We are talking about AI in classrooms, social scoring systems, and the highest forms, the high-riskiest forms of AI. And here we are now faced with a situation where certain risky AI applications that would normally be under clear rules to at least to some damage control, are trying to rush now to market because there's a grandfathering rule. If you're already in the market and after the rules come into effect, you make no further changes, no big changes to the system, then you can basically stay in a regulatory loophole. And this is just inviting bad actors to enter the European market and to do things that otherwise would be prohibited. So that damage sadly is already done. There were some nastier rules that we could prevent around exceptions for the high-risk category. You already had these exceptions in the original AI Act, but they were taken off so that you now could have these exceptions applicable to you even without being in the transparency register. And on this question, we could actually turn the Commission proposal around. There's also one nice thing here, not the ban on notifying apps. I think we can point to Elon Musk here with Grok, who in the middle of the negotiations created such a bad example that everyone could agree that this should really be prohibited. Thanks, Musk, I suppose. But yeah, this is at least the one good thing here. Let's talk about another big law that is part of the simplification agenda, the Digital Networks Act. This is a complete overhaul of Europe's telecommunication code. It was proposed on 26th of January this year, so it's quite new. And it is a drastic shift. Previously, telecom regulation was done nationally because networks are always localized and you have national regulators. And there are big differences actually in bringing internet to people in Sweden where you have fiber everywhere, or Romania where you just throw the cables over the roof, or in Germany where nothing works at all. And you can sometimes be happy that the energy and lights are still on. So the Digital Networks Act tries to change all of that. It tries to harmonize many things, centralize it more in the hands of the European Commission on several fronts. And most importantly for us, it is also a full frontal attack on net neutrality. The Commission proposes to copy-paste the original Open Internet regulation into the DNA, but make some changes that are actually very meaningful, and it would lead to a lot of the case law that we have to be annihilated. Things like the prohibition for zero rating, that you can no longer sell people 10 gigabytes of YouTube and, oh, look, they are 100 times cheaper than 10 gigabytes of normal internet, or sub-internet offers even. Offers where you are paying for individual applications, but not for the whole internet anymore. But the biggest issue looming over this net neutrality debate in this reform is the question of interconnection of network fees. What the Commission is proposing in a soft way, and we now already see in the Parliament that they want to deteriorate this text much further and make it into a hard rule, is to allow telecom providers to get money whenever data wants to enter their network. This means, in effect, this data doesn't inadvertently wander into the network of a telco. It's us internet subscribers, us users that are requesting those videos to be sent, those websites to be loaded onto our browsers. And suddenly that traffic that we are already paying for only reaches us adequately with enough quality if the other side of the connection is also paying. So suddenly a content provider also needs to pay every telco whose customers they want to reach. And that, of course, is the business model of the telephony era. That's the last time where we had these termination monopolies. And the Commission now wants to bring us back to the 90s and to force this telephony era business model on top of the internet. And that is extremely dangerous. We know who the players will be that will benefit from this. We did a survey once of the top 20 zero-rated apps in Europe, and 18 of those were from the US. So there is a lot of industry pushback around this on both sides. The telecom industry has big muscles, and we are in the middle of the debate. One common denominator to what Ralf has said that I want to point out to is that this is a trend that you see in general. Usually the Commission proposes laws, Parliament and Council, so the member states agree on something, and then we have a final legislation. But now we have these carve-outs where the Commission gives itself the power to specify things. It should be technical details, but it's more and more very important decisions that really concern our fundamental rights. On the GDPR, it was the definition of what is pseudonymization and when does data no longer count as personal data. And here in the Digital Networks Act, the Commission wants to decide what is a specialized service. So what is the exception from net neutrality? What is the vertically integrated form of access product that the telco can sell you without even caring about net neutrality? Because it's not applicable. You do not have to treat traffic equally with specialized services. Previously, the law and the regulators decided on this, and now the Commission basically wants to bring this decision under its prerogative. And that, of course, is dangerous because the Commission is a political body and not an independent regulator. We see this very clearly with the Digital Services Act and the inactivity, and I would say inability, of the Commission to do the work of a proper regulator. This is also not theoretical. The network fee debate, the question about interconnection, is in Germany already a problem. That's why the National Consumer Protection Organization, Gesellschaft für Freiheitsrechte in Germany, Access Epicenter Works, and law school professor from Stanford, Barbara Fshevik, are all suing Deutsche Telekom. And we are seeing net neutrality violations and what they're doing when data flows into the network. There's also netzbremse.de where you can read more about this. Let's talk about the strategic implications.
Yeah, because this is, of course, all happening in the context of a broader geopolitical situation, let's say. You might remember already last year in March at the Munich Security Conference, US Vice President J.D. Vance threatened basically to withdraw the NATO security guarantees in case the EU would dare to enforce the Digital Services Act on platforms like X. And last fall, for example, US Trade Secretary Lutnick was in Brussels and offered to lower the tariffs on steel and aluminum if the EU softens its digital rule book.
And now we also have information from Corporate European Observatory that there, of course, was heavy lobbying from big tech in the run-up to the Omnibus agenda, particularly the digital Omnibus agenda. And to give you a sense of the scale, we are talking about, I think it's over 150 millions budget, the official, the white label, out in the open budget of big tech when it comes to lobbying in just Brussels alone. And on average, they have one lobby meeting with the Commission per working day. And that gives you also a sense of what we as civil society are up against with our very limited resources. And here, there's also another strategic implication that I want to pause, because the so-called Brussels effect was something that researchers came up with in academic papers describing this proliferation of European high standards in data protection, in consumer protection, in environmental rules, you name it. Those good rules would proliferate simply because Brussels was such a big, Europe was such a big market. And if Brussels sets high standards, most companies would then apply these high standards to their whole portfolio, also to products they sell elsewhere in the world. And other jurisdictions would then also try to be on equal terms with the EU rule book, particularly on data protection. We have also this methodology of equivalency where a country wants to have adequate protection so that data can flow more easily. But this Brussels effect would be completely annihilated if Brussels suddenly reverts itself and changes the rules, particularly on core questions like the definitions of data protection. And so the 100 plus countries that adopted GDPR-style rules around the world are rightfully questioning whether that was a good idea. And of course, there's criticism.
You already have lawmakers like in the UK, just before Brexit, the UK legislator basically copied the GDPR into the UK law books. So they have a full application still of the GDPR, even they're not under European laws anymore. So based on that, personal data can flow very easily without limits between the UK and the EU because they got this adequacy decision from the Commission based on that. And UK lawmakers are now openly questioning how can we still be adequate with a moving target if the EU now changes its GDPR, But yeah, criticism came from all kinds of sides. Again, a video we cannot show you because the sound is not working remotely, but I can tell you what the guys say. This is from the first plenary debate we had just a week after the Omnibus was presented last November. This is Michael McNamara, Irish Liberal MEP, who basically here says we must avoid a Groucho Marx approach on legislation. These are my principles, but if you don't like them, I have others. These are my laws. If you don't like them, I have others. So yeah, half of the parliament is actually very critical about these omnibuses, the center-left groups in the parliament, but also some of the right-wing people even, but not only them.
We have, for example, the EU watchdog, Ombudswoman Teresa Añejo, who criticized the omnibus agenda simply because the rule the Commission gave itself around the better regulation principles were not adhered to. There was no impact assessment. There was no meaningful consultation. And on the GDPR, she clearly speaks about maladministration from the side of the Commission. Fun fact, you know how the Commission wants to respond to this criticism? They are now revising the better regulation principles. So they are non-compliant with their own quality standards. So we are simply lowering the quality standards. Yeah, this gives you food for thought. There's
simplification, hey.
Yeah, the OD regulation. There's also criticism from within the Commission. Commission Executive Vice President Teresa Rivera, she's the number one behind Ursula von der Leyen. And funny enough, also in charge of competition, called the whole spectacle Trumpist and a terrible political spectacle. And you can really see here also a party split between or within the Commission, because most of this agenda is driven by EPP. I always summarize this as it's basically the wish list of the European People's Party. Everything they didn't get in the past decade, they now want to get with the new right-wing majority in the House. Consumer protection organizations are, of course, up in arms about this and many other proposals in this agenda. So are digital rights organizations. 127 signed this particular letter, and many more have come since. And this is, as I said earlier, with the B slide, even going much further than the classical data protection groups, because this so-called simplification agenda, if you're working in the area of law, is really this wrecking ball that you can see right here. So where does this bring us? Where is the hope, Ralf?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny to see that now even companies are figuring out that this whole simplification agenda actually costs money. Because if you have new rules, suddenly, even if they are supposed to be simpler, you still need to adapt your existing business processes and maybe hire some consultants and even lawyers to help you with this and understand the new rules. And some of the rules, like the definition of personal data now, are not even simpler. They're more complicated. And it actually could be more costly to comply. But also the Commission's own red tape hit squad, like Politico calls it here, figured out that simplification isn't actually that simple. You can also see that in the Council. Normally laws are negotiated in Council on technical level by the experts, who often sometimes even fly from their capitals to Brussels for 2 days every 2 weeks or so to negotiate, like the data protection experts, let's say. But the whole simplification agenda is done by the so-called Anti-Chi simplification group. The Anti-Chi are the so-called Anti-Chi are the personal assistants of the EU ambassadors of the member states. So they are generalists. They don't know shit about the details of the definition of personal data, you know. And even they now figure out that it's a bit complicated and you actually might need some expertise in each field to really make sense of these new rules if you want to change them. So what's the timeline? Again, the proposal for the big digital omnibus came on 19th November last year. AI omnibus, as Thomas said, is finished. It was adopted in the June plenary in the European Parliament because there was this deadline on 2nd of August where the high-risk rules would have kicked in, which are now postponed. The data omnibus is only starting in Parliament. Because it was kind of put on hold because the same people more or less are working on the AI omnibus and the data omnibus. So we finished AI first. Now we're slowly starting with the data omnibus. Just yesterday evening, we received the so-called draft report from the 2 co-rapporteurs because it's dealt with in 2 committees. And we have now a deadline for tabling our amendments until 15th of July. So actually this is now a few weeks from now, 2 or 3 weeks, the opportunity to really reach out to your legislators in Brussels and tell them what they should table in terms of amendments. The position of member states, I put a question mark here when we finished our slides yesterday. It was on the agenda for the EU ambassadors for their meeting today, because Council has already much progressed on this, but it was taken off the agenda because a lot of member states are now also kind of bending in front of super heavy lobbying, in particular on the browser signals and all that, and the cookie banners. So it will not finish in Council under the Cypriot presidency, which ends end of June next week. And now, 1st of July, the Irish will take over the Council presidency for the next half year. And of course, you all know what's the issue with Ireland and big tech.
This is a joke. You could not have written that the Irish will renegotiate the GDPR.
Yeah, but also in the parliament, because it's also a lot of the Omnibus also contains a lot of laws that address non-personal data, like the Data Act, Data Governance Act, Open Data Directive, and so on. It's dealt with in joint committee procedure with the Civil Liberties Committee, my committee, and the Industry Committee. And in the Civil Liberties Committee, we have a rapporteur from the Social Democrats, former cyber ambassador of Estonia, Marina Kaljurand. Very cool, very senior experience, very close to us. Also very outspoken against chat control and things like that. But in the Industry Committee, the chief negotiator, the rapporteur, is Aura Sala, a Finnish conservative, which already is bad enough, but she's a former Meta lobbyist in Brussels. And she's openly saying the EU data protection regulations took a wrong turn 10 years ago when the GDPR was adopted. And we heard that in their first meeting, when they were just trying to sort out the modalities of working together, they were shouting at each other. Yeah, the draft report they presented yesterday was actually, because of that, very small, very thin, because they just couldn't agree on very much, you know. But maybe this is also the approach we should take for omnibuses, because it's different than when you want to adopt a law when there's no rules yet. Then you need to agree on something. But if you want to have an omnibus where there's already a law in place and you cannot agree on changes, then maybe don't change it. You know, that would be my advice. Yeah, on the Digital Networks Act, Thomas, this is your turf.
Yeah, so as I said earlier, the proposal was put forward in late January. It was scheduled for December, but it was postponed. And so now we have it. And we also got the first draft opinions from the two opinion committees, IMCO and LIBE. They are bad, really bad in part, particularly in IMCO. And we have deadline for amendments, I think, till September from the lawmakers. And in these two committees, and then ITRA, the lead committee, comes back in autumn. So we can expect a plenary vote sometime in 2027, I assume. And Council similarly has not made much progress on the file so far. This is a super heavy 300-page legislation that changes several other laws. And therefore, I expect that this will take up this whole term. The rapporteur even said that it might continue beyond this legislative term. So this is a biggie. And again, we have, in 2013, when net neutrality was first discussed and debated in the European Parliament, we had this carrot of roaming that was always used to undermine the fundamental rights, because yeah, we really want open internet, but yeah, what about cheaper roaming charges? And everybody was kind of weighing these two against each other. And this time we have another carrot, it's spectrum. So they want to use a more centralized approach towards handing out radio spectrum. And that, of course, is again something where the member states have vested interests in the form of several billions for these frequency auctions that are unduly mixed together here in the negotiations. And yeah, so we are still in early stages here. It's a normal procedure. It's not as fast as an omnibus. That gives us a little bit more time, but it also means that there's much more intense lobbying on all sides, and civil society needs to really be structured and to approach lawmakers about the importance of having an infrastructure that's neutral, where big tech cannot buy preferential treatment, where every school child has the same access to the whole internet at home, and a teacher, a parent can be assured that there's no difference in how you can use the internet simply because you have bigger or lower pockets. So that's where we are here. And what are activists doing in Brussels? There are actually great examples. One, the Omnibus came out in front of the Parlement, the headquarters of the European Commission, People versus Big Tech, together with Corporate European Observatory and ADRI, did this action where Ursula was called upon to fight for Europe and not for the big tech bros. Greenpeace recently even upended this with making the Parlement the Trump Tower. This was really funny and fitting. And you can see where all of this is going. It is pointing to the real interest behind these reforms and why Europe and should stand firm with what citizens expect, which is being protected from these companies and their AI tools. There's much more substantive work that is happening already, where also more help is always welcome. We have ample amount of policy analysis of reaching out to MEPs. Even the small countries, it's super important that they hear in their own language from their constituency why this is important and what we as society, as academics, as activists, as informed population want to hear from them, want them to do, and raising awareness even by just sharing posts, tweets, policy analysis, blog posts, videos that are funny, or making those videos, or subscribing to newsletters, or donating to NGOs. All of this is super important in this moment. And I think, have I forgotten anything, Ralf, before we come to the post?
No, maybe the idea that if you want to do something about all these omnibuses, but in your local town there is no big digital rights NGO active or something, maybe reach out to the local beekeeping association or the local beekeepers and see if they are aware and if you can help them. You know, they are nice people, I heard.
Yeah, and we live off donations. Our NGO always is happy for more supporting members. This is how we pay the salaries of our staff, and this is what keeps us independent and active and gives us the power to meet this moment. And if we still have time, we would be very, very happy to answer your questions.
I don't hear anything.
Yes, we just unmuted, but not in time for you to hear the great applause that was here. Yes, thank you for the great talk. So now we go to questions. Yes, I will repeat the questions from the audience when they come. There's the first one here.
Okay. If this Omnibus proposal passes in the current bad form, how likely is it that the Court of Justice will just invalidate most of it at least? And if that were to happen, how can it happen sooner? Because I know that my students have been going to the Court of Justice like 3 times, and it always takes a long time.
Yes,
I couldn't really hear very well, sorry.
I think the question was about the ECJ, like if the Omnibus passes, couldn't the Court of Justice of the European Union simply annul these unconstitutional changes? And of course it could, but I, as someone who has done this, I can tell you it takes years, and very often the damage is done, and usually you cannot remove it without traces. So the ball post is still moved, even if you win in the court. This is only an ex post help and the patch on the wound. The damage is still done. But Ralf, how do you see this with the GDPR?
Yeah, I mean, on some of the proposed rules, they are probably in the remit of what the legislators can do and cannot do. It's up to the European legislators. But we have different majorities now since 2 years ago, since the last European elections. We have a structural center-right majority. But on some core elements, I would argue, like the definition of personal data, because we already have the fundamental right to the protection of your personal data in the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the Union, which cannot be amended by simple legislation. And the explanatory memorandum of the Charter referred back in the day to the existing 95 directive on data protection and the definition of personal data in there, which is basically copied into the GDPR. We only added the recital on singling out. And therefore, a lot of lawyers say that this definition of personal data basically has constitutional quality already in Europe and cannot easily be amended by the legislator. But it's never been tested at the court. So our hope is to now prevent this in the legislative process. It seems actually that on the definition of personal data, we are already succeeding because in council it is taken out, the changes. And also when we had a first round on political level with the members of parliament who work on this in both committees, basically everybody except the conservatives said we don't want to change it. It's maybe going too far to change such a core element. So on that front, I'm slightly hopeful. But again, there's also other things like this crazy definition of scientific research and commission empowering itself to do implementing acts and all that shit, and the abuse of data access requests where we need a political fight. I'm not sure if we could challenge that in court, actually.
About how long it always takes to go to the Court of Justice. Is it kind of a structural issue with how the EU works, that it always takes 3 years or something, or even more, to get a decision, for example, in the Trans-Atlantic Border 2 case?
Again, I have issues to understand the audio. Maybe the people need to get closer to the microphone or so. But did you understand, Thomas?
No, not completely. Could you repeat, please?
Yes, I can repeat the question. So the question was, if I summarize it, is why normally it takes so long for...
It's a structural issue within the European Union, basically.
If it's a structural issue within the European Union, that it takes so long to adopt, they capture everything?
Yeah, I mean, so of course, Europe is much better than the US in making laws, also because it took a completely opposite approach. Every branch of government in the US can start a law, but it's very hard to finish one. In Europe, it's super hard to start it, but then it's almost inevitable that something with that title will be finished. Yes, it takes longer. National lawmaking usually half a year, EU usually 3 to 5 years, roughly. And so therefore, we have much more players that are involved. This is not a homogeneous body. There are still a lot of diversity within council and parliament that needs to be ironed out. And then we have these crazy things called trilogue that are super undemocratic, but this is how it's done. So there are definitely structural issues that deteriorate the quality of lawmaking, particularly the ones where we have less transparency. I would argue against. But in general, I'm still, as someone who works on both fronts, would say that on European laws, we have better quality and people are actually thinking it through. Whereas in national legislation, I can point you to so many dirtily drafted things that are just the brainchild of a few people that never really took outside advice into consideration even. So I'm not sure what it's actually structurally bad in terms of quality. It could be expedited and faster. But then again, if that would make the quality of the laws worse, I wouldn't like it. Let's be slow and good.
Maybe also to point out that the European Parliament is kind of a unique body. It's not working like normal national parliaments, because in national parliaments, you normally have a clear division between the governing coalition and the opposition. And the coalition normally supports laws that come out of their government, out of the ministries, and then they're maybe slightly amended in the parliamentary procedure, but normally you follow your ministers, and then it gets adopted. Here in Europe, it's different. You have the commission, but the commission is kind of, once elected, it's like the other institution. It's not really, it's the other institution. And when the commission makes a proposal, it really, in each case, we can see where the majorities lie, even within a legislative proposal for each topic, let's say. Sometimes we have center-left majorities. I mean, structurally we don't have them anymore after the last election. But when we have reasonable people within EPP working on a file and we have good arguments also, then it's often easy to convince also conservatives that they should go this or that way. But on other fronts, if the conservatives want to do something really against us and the socialists and so on, they now can have a structural majority with the far right and the fascists. But even there, sometimes the fascists, like the Patriots for Europe, are closer to us than to EPP, in particular in issues around data protection and privacy, thanks to the chat control fight, because suddenly they are where the people care about their privacy, and as good populists, then they listen, So it's really not clear at the beginning of a legislative process how the outcome will be. It's sometimes a bit difficult for people out there, but I think it's more reflecting the actual will of elected people here.
Yes, thank you very much. And now I think because we're running a bit out of time for the lunch, I think we will cut it here. So let's thank our speakers and the speakers.